Silas Wellington had very specific requirements when he placed his advertisement in the Boston Herald's matrimonial section. Seeking small, quiet wife for Montana ranch. Must be under 5 feet tall, gentle disposition, skilled in domestic arts. At 5 feet 4 inches himself, Silas figured a petite woman would make him feel properly masculine, the way a man ought to feel when he walked into town with his bride on his arm. For 32 years, Silas had been acutely aware that God had shortchanged him in the height department. Every conversation required him to crane his neck upward, every handshake reminded him of his compact stature, and every dance at the town social left him feeling like a boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The women of Millerville were polite enough, but he'd seen the way their eyes drifted over his head, searching for taller, more impressive prospects. That's why he'd turned to the mail-order bride agencies. Through letters, a man could present his best qualities: his successful ranch, his gentle nature, his commitment to providing for a family, without standing next to someone for size comparison. The arrangement seemed perfect. He'd specified his requirements, received a lovely photograph of a delicate woman named Charlotte Mason, and exchanged a dozen letters that convinced him he'd found his ideal match. Charlotte had written in careful script about her love of cooking and gardening, her quiet nature, and her eagerness to start fresh in the frontier territories. She'd mentioned being different from other women, but Silas had assumed she meant her willingness to marry a stranger and move west. Her letters painted the picture of exactly the kind of wife he'd imagined: small enough to make him feel protective, domestic enough to create the warm home he'd always wanted. The whole town of Millerville had turned out to see Silas collect his bride from the morning train. It wasn't often that someone imported a wife from back east, and the local gossips had been speculating for weeks about what kind of woman would agree to marry sight unseen. Silas had spent an hour getting ready, polishing his boots, trimming his beard, and practicing the speech he'd prepared for their first meeting. He stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, scanning the train windows for a glimpse of Charlotte's heart-shaped face from the photograph. The other passengers disembarked first: a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, 2 cowboys heading to work the northern ranches. Then the train gave a final hiss of steam, and she appeared. Charlotte Mason stepped onto the platform like a queen descending from her carriage, and Silas's carefully rehearsed words died in his throat. She was indeed different from other women. She was the tallest woman he'd ever seen in his life, at least 6 feet in her traveling boots, with broad shoulders, long limbs, and a presence that made every person on the platform take a step back and stare. The crowd's murmur died to absolute silence as Charlotte's eyes found his across the platform. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they simply looked at each other: the tiny cowboy who'd ordered a small wife, and the giant woman who'd come to marry him. What neither of them knew was that sometimes the most unexpected packages contain exactly what your heart has been searching for. The silence stretched across the train platform like a taut wire ready to snap. Charlotte Mason stood frozen beside her traveling trunk, towering over every soul present like a magnificent redwood among saplings. At 6 feet and 2 inches, in her leather boots, she commanded attention without seeking it, her emerald green traveling dress making her appear even more statuesque against the dusty Montana backdrop. Silas felt his face burn with embarrassment as every eye on the platform darted between him and the woman who was supposed to be his bride. He'd expected to look down at Charlotte's delicate features, perhaps offer his arm to help her navigate the rough platform. Instead, he found himself craning his neck upward, feeling more like a child meeting his school teacher than a man greeting his future wife. "Mr. Wellington?" Charlotte's voice carried clearly across the platform, cultured and confident, despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. "I believe you're expecting me." "Yes, ma'am," Silas managed, his voice cracking slightly. "That is, yes, Miss Mason. I'm Silas Wellington." He took a tentative step forward, acutely aware of the snickers and whispered comments from the gathered crowd. Old Pete Martinez from the general store wasn't even trying to hide his amusement, and Mrs. Henderson was fanning herself with such vigor she might take flight. "Didn't know they grew 'em that big back east," someone muttered, followed by a burst of poorly suppressed laughter. Charlotte's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure with the grace of someone who'd endured a lifetime of such comments. She descended the train steps with careful dignity, each movement deliberate and poised. When she reached the platform proper, the full impact of their height difference became even more pronounced. "I suppose," Charlotte said quietly, her voice carrying just the slightest tremor, "this isn't quite what you were expecting." Silas looked up into her face, really looked at her for the first time. The photograph hadn't lied about her features. She was indeed beautiful, with intelligent hazel eyes, high cheekbones, and honey-colored hair arranged in an elegant traveling style. But the photograph had been a careful close-up that revealed nothing about her impressive stature. "No, ma'am," Silas admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "I reckon it's not what either of us expected." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Silas caught sight of several people exchanging coins. Apparently, there had been betting on how this first meeting would go. The humiliation burned in his throat, but when he looked back at Charlotte, he saw something in her expression that gave him pause. She wasn't looking at him with pity or disdain. If anything, she looked as uncertain and vulnerable as he felt. "Perhaps," Charlotte said carefully, "we should discuss this somewhere more private." "Yes," Silas agreed quickly, grateful for her suggestion. "Yes, that's a fine idea. My wagon's just over there." He gestured toward his modest buckboard, then realized with growing mortification that he'd need to help her up. The wagon that had always seemed perfectly adequate now looked like a toy next to Charlotte's imposing figure. "Allow me," Silas said, offering his hand with as much dignity as he could muster. Charlotte accepted his assistance with careful grace, though they both knew she could have easily stepped into the wagon without help. As she settled onto the bench seat, Silas noticed how she automatically hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself appear smaller. A gesture so unconscious it spoke of years of practice. The ride to his ranch passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creaking of wagon wheels and the distant sound of the crowd dispersing behind them. Silas stole glances at his unexpected bride, trying to reconcile the woman beside him with the delicate creature he'd imagined. Charlotte sat ramrod straight, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap, staring straight ahead at the Montana landscape. "It's beautiful country," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am." "Gets a man to thinking about bigger things than himself," Silas replied, then immediately winced at his poor choice of words. Charlotte's lips twitched slightly, whether with amusement or annoyance he couldn't tell. "Mr. Wellington," she said as they approached his ranch house, "I feel I owe you an explanation." "No explanation necessary," Silas said quickly, though they both knew that wasn't true. "Nevertheless," Charlotte turned to face him fully, and Silas was struck by the directness of her gaze. "I may have been less than entirely forthcoming in my correspondence." "About your height, you mean?" "Among other things." Charlotte's voice carried a note of defiance now. "I've learned that mentioning my stature early in any courtship tends to discourage potential suitors." Silas brought the wagon to a stop in front of his modest ranch house, taking a moment to consider her words. "How many men have you discouraged, Miss Mason?" "All of them," Charlotte replied with bitter honesty. "Every last one. Do you know what it's like, Mr. Wellington, to walk into a room and watch grown men take a step backward? To have mothers pull their sons away as if my height might be contagious?" There was pain in her voice now, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Silas found himself really looking at her again. Not at her height, but at her. He saw the way she held herself with careful dignity, despite obvious embarrassment, the intelligence in her eyes, the strength it must have taken to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. "I reckon I do," he said quietly, though for different reasons. Charlotte studied his face with new interest. "You understand what it's like to be wrong-sized?" "Every day of my life," Silas admitted, "though I suppose we're wrong-sized in opposite directions." For the first time since stepping off the train, Charlotte smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Yes, I suppose we are." Silas climbed down from the wagon and moved to help Charlotte descend, but she was already stepping down with fluid grace. Standing beside the wagon, the full extent of their height difference was impossible to ignore. The top of Silas's hat barely reached Charlotte's chin. "Mr. Wellington," Charlotte said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone, I understand if you wish to send me back to Boston on the next train. I have enough money for return passage, and I won't hold you to any obligation you may feel under the circumstances. Silas considered this, studying the woman who stood before him like a queen offering to abdicate her throne. She was nothing like what he'd ordered, nothing like what he'd imagined. She was tall where he'd wanted small, imposing where he'd wanted delicate, commanding where he'd wanted submissive. And yet something about her intrigued him. Maybe it was the vulnerability he glimpsed beneath her careful composure, or the way she'd handled the platform humiliation with more grace than he'd managed. Maybe it was simply that they were both outsiders in a world that seemed designed for people of different proportions. "Miss Mason," he said finally, "would you consider staying for supper? We could discuss the situation properly, get to know each other a bit before making any hasty decisions." Charlotte's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she hadn't expected this response. "You're not horrified by the deception?" "Well," Silas said, managing a small smile, "I reckon we both learned that photographs can be misleading. Seems only fair we give each other a chance to make a better impression than we did on that platform." Charlotte studied his face for a long moment, and Silas found himself holding his breath. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Wellington. I accept your invitation for supper, but I think it's only fair to warn you. I'm not just tall, I'm also opinionated, independent, and I've been told I have entirely too many thoughts for a proper lady." Silas felt his smile widen. "Miss Mason, after today's surprises, I'm beginning to think proper might be overrated." As they walked toward the ranch house together, Charlotte shortening her stride to match his, Silas lengthening his to keep up with hers, neither of them noticed how naturally they'd begun to accommodate each other's differences. The afternoon sun cast their shadows on the ground behind them, one impossibly tall, one compact and sturdy, but somehow walking in perfect step. The first test of their unlikely partnership had been surviving the platform. The second would be learning whether two people who'd spent their lives feeling wrong-sized could somehow fit together in ways that mattered more than height. The morning after Charlotte's arrival brought the first real test of their unconventional arrangement. Silas woke before dawn as always, but hesitated outside the guest room where he'd settled his unexpected bride. How did one approach domestic life with a woman who could probably see over his roof from ground level? His question was answered when he found Charlotte already in the kitchen, dressed in a practical brown skirt and white blouse, attempting to work at his counter. The sight was both amusing and slightly heartbreaking. She was bent nearly in half to reach the work surface, her tall frame folded like an accordion. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," she said, straightening with obvious relief when he entered. "I was trying to prepare breakfast, but I'm afraid your kitchen wasn't designed with someone of my proportions in mind." Silas looked at his kitchen with new eyes, seeing it from Charlotte's perspective. Everything that was perfectly suited to his compact frame would be torture for her. The counters hit her at mid-thigh, the cabinets required her to stoop, and she'd have to practically crawl to use the lower storage. "No, I reckon it wasn't," he admitted. "Never had cause to think about it before." Charlotte gestured helplessly at the half-prepared eggs. "I've managed to crack these, but cooking them properly is proving challenging." Without thinking, Silas stepped forward. "Here, let me. You could, well, maybe you could reach the top shelf there. I've been storing things up there because I can't get to them without a ladder." Charlotte's face brightened. "Of course. What do you need?" For the next hour, they developed an impromptu system. Charlotte handled everything that required height, retrieving items from high shelves, hanging laundry on the line, even dusting the tops of door frames that Silas had ignored for years. Meanwhile, Silas took care of tasks that required working at standard counter height, his compact frame moving efficiently through the lower spaces. "You know," Charlotte said as she easily reached a sack of flour that had been gathering dust on the highest shelf, "I don't think I've ever met someone who could actually use my height as an advantage rather than seeing it as a problem." "Well," Silas replied, expertly flipping pancakes at the stove, "I've never met someone who could make me feel useful for being short instead of apologetic about it." They shared a smile over breakfast, the first genuine moment of connection since Charlotte's arrival. The food was better than either could have managed alone. Charlotte's reach had uncovered ingredients Silas had forgotten he owned, while his cooking skills turned them into a proper meal. "Mr. Wellington," Charlotte said as they finished eating, "may I ask you something personal?" "Seems we're past the point of standing on ceremony, Miss Mason." "Ask away." "Why did you specify height in your advertisement? Most men mention things like cooking ability or religious devotion." Silas set down his coffee cup, considering his answer. "I suppose I thought a small woman would make me feel more like the man I imagined I ought to be. Taller, stronger, more." He gestured vaguely. "More masculine?" "Something like that." Silas met her eyes. "Foolish, I know." "Not foolish," Charlotte said quietly. "I understand completely. I've spent my entire adult life making myself smaller, hoping to find someone who wouldn't be intimidated by my size. We've both been trying to fit into shapes that don't suit us." After breakfast, Silas offered to show Charlotte around the ranch. As they walked the property, he found himself seeing everything through dual perspectives. His own familiar view and Charlotte's elevated one. "Your fencing needs work along the north pasture," Charlotte observed, shading her eyes with her hand as she gazed across his land. "I can see where several posts have shifted from here." Silas squinted in the direction she indicated. "I can't make out the details from this distance." "My eyesight's good, but I have the advantage of height," Charlotte finished. "Just as you have the advantage of seeing details I might miss. Different perspectives can be useful." They spent the morning working together, and Silas discovered that Charlotte's height wasn't just a curiosity, it was genuinely helpful. She could spot problems across long distances, reach things he couldn't, and handle tasks that required leverage from above. Meanwhile, his lower center of gravity and compact build made him better at detailed work, fitting into tight spaces and maintaining balance on uneven ground. "You know," Silas said as Charlotte easily reset a fence post that would have required him to fetch a ladder, "I'm beginning to think we might make a decent team." "Are you surprised?" "Honestly? Yes. I thought, I thought I needed someone small to take care of. Turns out maybe I need someone who can take care of things I can't reach." Charlotte laughed, a warm, genuine sound that surprised them both. "And I thought I needed someone tall enough to make me feel delicate. Instead, I find someone who makes me feel useful." That afternoon brought their first real challenge when Mrs. Henderson and two other ranch wives arrived for what was clearly an inspection visit. Silas watched Charlotte's posture change the moment she spotted the approaching buggy, her shoulders straightening defensively. "The welcoming committee," Silas murmured. "They mean well, but they're here to see the freak show," Charlotte finished, her voice carefully neutral. "Now, Miss Mason." "Charlotte, if we're going to face this together, you might as well use my given name." "Charlotte, then, and I'm Silas." He looked at her seriously. "They're going to stare and whisper. They'll probably say things that aren't kind, but you don't have to shrink yourself for their comfort." Charlotte looked down at him with surprise. "You'd defend me, even though I'm not what you ordered?" "You're my guest," Silas said simply, "and maybe more than that, if we can figure this out. Either way, you deserve respect." The visit went about as expected. Mrs. Henderson tried to be polite, but her eyes kept widening every time Charlotte stood to her full height. The other women were less tactful, making pointed comments about unusual arrangements and what happens when people get ideas above their station. "Such an interesting choice for a bride," Mrs. Patterson observed, her voice carrying that particular tone women used when they wanted to sound charitable while being anything but. "Charlotte's been invaluable around the ranch," Silas replied evenly. "Amazing how much easier certain tasks become when you have the right person for the job." "Oh, I'm sure she's very capable," Mrs. Henderson said, the pause speaking volumes. Charlotte maintained her composure throughout the visit, but Silas could see the cost. She held herself rigidly, answered questions in careful, measured tones, and seemed to fold inward with each barbed comment. When the ladies finally left, she sank into a chair with obvious relief. "Well," she said, attempting lightness, "that went better than expected. No one actually fainted." "Charlotte." Silas sat across from her. "You don't have to pretend it didn't hurt." She looked at him with surprise, then her careful composure cracked slightly. It's nothing I haven't heard before. Unusual. Above her station. Not quite right. I've been hearing variations of it my entire life. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it predictable. Charlotte straightened again. Silas, I need you to understand something. If this arrangement becomes permanent, you'll be dealing with this for the rest of your life. People will stare. They'll whisper. They'll make jokes about the short man and his giant wife. Silas considered this. And you'll be dealing with being married to a man who has to stand on a box to kiss you? Charlotte's eyes widened, then she laughed. A startled, delighted sound. Is that what you're worried about? Among other things. Silas Wellington, Charlotte said, leaning forward in her chair. I've been bending down to accommodate the world my entire life. If you think I'd mind leaning down for a kiss from a good man, you haven't been paying attention. The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Silas found himself looking at Charlotte not as the woman who'd failed to meet his specifications, but as herself, intelligent, resilient, and surprisingly compatible despite their obvious differences. Charlotte, he said carefully, would you consider extending your stay? Not out of obligation, but to see if we might actually suit each other. Charlotte studied his face for a long moment. You really mean that, don't you? Despite the staring, the comments, the complete failure of your original plan? Especially because of the failure of my original plan, Silas replied. Turns out what I thought I wanted and what I actually need might be two different things. And what do you think you need? Silas smiled. A partner who can see trouble coming from a mile away, reach the high shelves, and isn't afraid to take up space in the world. Someone who makes me feel not smaller, but more complete. Charlotte's smile in return was radiant. In that case, Mr. Wellington, Silas, I believe I'd like to stay and see where this leads. Outside, the sun was setting over the Montana landscape, casting long shadows across the ranch. But inside the small cabin, two people who'd spent their lives feeling wrong-sized were beginning to discover that sometimes the most unlikely combinations create the most perfect fit. 2 weeks into Charlotte's stay, the novelty of the giant bride had worn off for most of Millerville, replaced by something more insidious. A steady stream of gossip, speculation, and barely concealed mockery that followed them wherever they went. Silas had hoped the initial shock would fade into acceptance, but instead it seemed to be crystallizing into permanent disapproval. The first real confrontation came on a Saturday morning when they rode into town for supplies. Charlotte had insisted on driving the wagon herself, her long arms making it easier to handle the reins, while Silas sat beside her looking up directions and managing the shopping list. To them, it had become a natural arrangement. To the townspeople gathering outside Miller's general store, it was apparently scandalous. "Look at that," sneered Jake Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, loud enough to be clearly heard. "Man can't even drive his own wagon. Has to let his woman do it because her arms are longer. Probably has to stand on a box to reach her lips," added Bill Patterson with a crude laugh. "Wonder what else he needs help reaching." Silas felt Charlotte tense beside him, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the reins. He started to stand, anger flaring in his chest, but Charlotte's hand on his arm stopped him. "Don't," she said quietly. "It will only make it worse." "Charlotte, I can't just sit here while they—" "Yes, you can, because engaging with them gives them what they want." Charlotte's voice was steady, but Silas could hear the pain beneath the control. "I've learned that the hard way." They completed their shopping in strained silence, Charlotte hunching her shoulders and trying to make herself smaller, while Silas fought the urge to defend her honor against every whispered comment and poorly hidden smirk. By the time they loaded their supplies and headed home, both were wound tight with frustration. "This is what I meant," Charlotte said as soon as they were out of town. "This is what your life will be like if I stay. Every trip to town, every social gathering, every interaction with your neighbors will involve them thinking less of you because of me." Silas considered this as their wagon bounced along the rutted road. "Charlotte, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Back in Boston, when people stared and whispered, did you ever have anyone stand up for you?" Charlotte was quiet for so long, Silas thought she wouldn't answer. No, she said finally. Never. My own family was embarrassed by me. They thought if I just tried harder to be smaller, less noticeable, maybe I could find someone willing to overlook my defects. And how did that make you feel? Like I was a mistake that needed to be hidden. Silas nodded. Well, I reckon that's the difference between us and them. You're not a mistake to me, and I'm not ashamed of you. If they want to think less of me for that, that's their choice. Charlotte turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. You really mean that? I do. Though I'm thinking maybe we need to stop letting them set the rules. What do you mean? Silas smiled, an idea forming. I mean, maybe it's time we stopped apologizing for who we are and started showing them what we can do together. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, young Tommy Peterson came racing up to their ranch in a state of panic. His horse had thrown him near Widow Crawford's place, and she wasn't answering her door. The boy was worried she might be hurt, but her cabin was built against a steep hillside with windows set high off the ground. I can't see in, Tommy gasped. Too high up. Pa's gone to the northern range, and Sheriff Morrison's dealing with trouble in the next county. Don't know who else to ask. Silas and Charlotte exchanged a look. We'll come, Silas said immediately. At Widow Crawford's cabin, the problem was immediately clear. The windows were indeed set high, too high for Silas or Tommy to see through, and the door was barred from inside. They could hear faint sounds from within, but couldn't tell if Mrs. Crawford was in distress. I could try to break down the door, Silas said, studying the solid wood construction. Or, Charlotte said thoughtfully, I could look through the window and see what's actually happening before we go breaking things. She approached the cabin wall and, with minimal effort, peered through the high window. She's inside, Charlotte called back. Looks like she's fallen. She's conscious but can't get up. Can you see how to get in? Charlotte moved to another window. There's a window latch I can reach from here. Give me a moment. With her height advantage, she was able to work the latch and push the window open. It's large enough for someone to climb through, but I'm too short and you're too big, Silas finished. Actually, Charlotte said with a smile, I think we're exactly the right sizes. Tommy, come here. Working together, Charlotte lifted Tommy to window level, while Silas guided the boy's feet and provided stability from below. Tommy was able to squeeze through the window, unlock the door from inside, and let them in to help Mrs. Crawford, who had indeed fallen and twisted her ankle badly. Word of the rescue spread quickly through Millerville. By evening, half the town knew that the mismatched couple had saved Widow Crawford using the very traits people had been mocking. Charlotte's height had been essential for reaching the windows. Silas's strength and stability had made the assist possible, and their ability to work together had solved a problem that would have stumped either of them alone. The reaction was mixed. Some people began to see Charlotte's size as an asset rather than an oddity. Others doubled down on their disapproval, as if the couple's competence somehow made their differences even more threatening to the natural order of things. Don't matter what good they do, Silas overheard Mrs. Patterson saying at the general store the following week. Still ain't natural. A man having to look up to his woman like that goes against the way God intended things. This time, Silas didn't stay silent. Mrs. Patterson, he said, stepping into view, I'm curious. When you're hanging laundry on the line, do you use a stool? Well, yes, but... And when your husband needs something from the high shelf in your pantry, does he get a ladder? That's different. How's it different? Seems to me God gave people different heights so we could help each other reach things. Maybe the problem isn't that Charlotte's tall. Maybe the problem is that the rest of us have been thinking too small. Mrs. Patterson huffed and turned away, but Silas noticed several other people nodding thoughtfully at his words. That evening, as Silas and Charlotte sat on their porch watching the sunset, she surprised him with a question. Silas, what made you decide to defend me today? You could have just ignored Mrs. Patterson. Same thing that makes you reach the high shelves without being asked, Silas replied. Some things are just the right thing to do. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. I've never had anyone fight for me before. Not in words, not in actions, not in any way that mattered. Well, you've got someone now. If you want him. Charlotte turned to study his face in the fading light. Are you proposing to me, Silas Wellington? I'm saying that if you're willing to put up with a man who needs a step stool to kiss you properly, I'd be honored to spend my life reaching high shelves in return. Charlotte's laugh was soft and warm. You know, I never thought about it that way. All my life, people have told me I was too much, too tall, too strong, too opinionated. But you make me feel like I'm exactly enough. You are exactly enough. More than enough. You're... Silas paused, searching for words. Charlotte, I ordered a small, quiet wife because I thought that would make me feel like a big, important man. But you make me feel like a better man. There's a difference. What's the difference? A big man tries to make everyone else smaller. A better man helps everyone around him reach their full height. Charlotte stood and moved to the porch railing, her tall frame silhouetted against the Montana sky. Silas, if we do this, if we marry, it won't get easier. People will always stare. They'll always have opinions about our unconventional arrangement. Silas joined her at the railing, having to look up to meet her eyes. Charlotte, I've spent 32 years apologizing for who I am, trying to find ways to seem bigger or more important. These past weeks with you, I've felt more like myself than I ever have. If people want to stare at that, let them stare. And if they think less of you for marrying someone like me, then they don't know what they're looking at. They see a mismatch. I see a partnership. Silas took her hand, so much smaller than hers but fitting perfectly within her palm. Besides, seems to me the only opinions that matter are ours. What do you think, Charlotte? Do we fit? Charlotte looked down at their joined hands, then out at the vast Montana landscape that had brought them together. You know what I think? I think we fit exactly the way we're supposed to. Not the way other people expected, but the way we were meant to. Is that a yes? Charlotte's smile lit up the gathering darkness. That's a yes, Silas Wellington. Let's scandalize this town properly and get married. As they stood together on the porch, the tall woman and the compact man, both finally unashamed of who they were, neither of them noticed that they cast a single, perfectly proportioned shadow in the moonlight. The engagement announcement should have been a time of celebration, but instead it brought unwelcome attention from an unexpected source. 3 days after Silas had formally proposed and Charlotte had accepted, a stranger arrived on the afternoon train from Boston, a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself to anyone who would listen as Charlotte's uncle, Edmund Fairmont. Silas was repairing a section of fence when he spotted the man approaching on foot, his city shoes already dusty from the walkout from town. Everything about Edmund Fairmont screamed disapproval, from his pinched expression to the way he surveyed the modest ranch as if it personally offended him. Mr. Wellington, I presume? The man's voice carried the crisp accent of old Boston money. I am Edmund Fairmont, Charlotte's uncle and legal guardian in the absence of her father. Silas straightened, wiping his hands on his work shirt. Mr. Fairmont, Charlotte didn't mention expecting family. Charlotte doesn't know I'm here. I came as soon as I received word of this arrangement. Edmund's gaze swept over Silas dismissively. I can see why she failed to mention the particulars in her letters home. Before Silas could respond, Charlotte emerged from the ranch house, having spotted their visitor through the kitchen window. Even at a distance, Silas could see the way her posture changed, shoulders straightening defensively. Uncle Edmund, Charlotte said as she approached, her voice carefully controlled. This is unexpected. Charlotte. Edmund's greeting was stiff with disapproval. I've come to bring you home. This ridiculous charade has gone on long enough. I am home, Charlotte replied quietly, but Silas caught the slight tremor in her voice. Edmund laughed harshly. Home? In this wilderness? With a man who barely reaches your shoulder? Charlotte, have you lost your senses entirely? Mr. Fairmont, Silas interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge. I'll thank you to speak respectfully about my fiancé. Fiancé? Edmund's eyebrows rose in genuine shock. You actually intend to go through with this farce? Charlotte, surely you can see how unsuitable this is. What kind of children would such a union produce? What kind of life? Charlotte's face went white. and Silas felt anger surge in his chest. "Sir, you've said quite enough." "Have I?" "Look at the two of you," Edmund gestured wildly. "It's unnatural." "Charlotte, you're coming home with me. I've already spoken to the Hendricks family. Young Robert is still available, and he's willing to overlook your eccentricities." "Robert Hendricks is 6 feet tall and has the personality of wet paste," Charlotte said flatly, "and I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't have a choice. Your father gave me authority to act in his stead, and I'm exercising that authority now. This engagement is terminated, and you're returning to Boston, where you belong." Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Edmund and Charlotte. "She's of legal age and can make her own decisions. You have no authority here." "Don't I?" Edmund smiled coldly and pulled a folded document from his jacket. "This is a writ of commitment, signed by Dr. Hartwell in Boston. It declares Charlotte mentally incompetent due to her, shall we say, unusual decision-making regarding this engagement. I can have her confined to a private sanitarium until she comes to her senses." The silence that followed was deafening. Silas felt Charlotte go rigid behind him, and when he glanced back, he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Genuine fear. "You can't," Charlotte whispered. "I assure you I can. Dr. Hartwell has already sworn that any woman who would travel across the country to marry a man half her size is clearly suffering from some form of nervous condition. The local authorities will have no choice but to honor the commitment order." Silas looked at the document, his mind racing. He knew enough about legal matters to recognize that Edmund wasn't bluffing. In 1885, wealthy families had broad powers when it came to controlling their difficult members, especially women who stepped outside social norms. "What do you want?" Silas asked quietly. "Charlotte comes home with me immediately. She undergoes proper medical evaluation and treatment. When she's thinking clearly again, we'll arrange a suitable marriage to someone of appropriate stature and breeding. And if she refuses," Edmund's smile was predatory, "then I invoke the commitment order and she spends the next several years in an institution." "Her choice." Charlotte moved to stand beside Silas, her voice shaking but determined. "You bastard. You absolute bastard." "Language, Charlotte." That sort of outburst only supports Dr. Hartwell's diagnosis. Silas watched the color drain from Charlotte's face as she realized the trap her uncle had laid. Any resistance would be viewed as further evidence of mental instability. Any show of emotion would be seen as proof of her unfitness to make her own decisions. "How long?" Silas asked. "I beg your pardon?" "How long do we have to decide?" Edmund consulted his pocket watch. "The evening train leaves at 6 o'clock. Charlotte will be on it, one way or another." After Edmund left to take rooms at the boarding house in town, Charlotte collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. "He's going to do it," she said numbly. "He'll have me committed, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." Silas sat beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. "We'll figure something out." "No, we won't. Don't you understand? He holds all the cards. In the eyes of the law, I'm an unmarried woman whose family considers her mentally unstable. My decision to marry you will be seen as proof of that instability. Then we don't give him the chance to use that argument." Charlotte looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean we get married. Today, right now if possible." "Silas, that's impossible. We need licenses, witnesses, a minister. Pastor Williams lives just 2 miles from here. Judge Morrison can issue a license. We can have witnesses from town if we need them." Silas stood, his mind racing through the logistics. "If you're already my wife when your uncle tries to invoke that commitment order, it becomes much harder for him to claim authority over you." Charlotte stared at him. "You would do that? Marry me under these circumstances with a gun to our heads?" "Charlotte, I was planning to marry you anyway. The only difference is timing." "But what if he's right? What if I am unstable for wanting this? What if people are right to think we're wrong for each other?" Silas knelt beside her chair, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Charlotte, listen to me. You are the sanest, strongest, most rational person I've ever met. You traveled across the country not because you're unstable, but because you're brave enough to take control of your own life. You chose to stay here not because you're confused, but because you're smart enough to recognize something good when you find it. And if we're wrong, if this is all some delusion, then it's a delusion I'm happy to share. Silas stood and extended his hand. Charlotte Fairmont, will you marry me this afternoon and help me prove to your uncle and everyone else that love doesn't have to fit their expectations? Charlotte looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly placed hers in it. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I will. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Pastor Williams, when the situation was explained, readily agreed to perform the ceremony. Judge Morrison grumbled about the short notice, but issued the license. Word spread quickly through town, and by 4 o'clock the small church was packed with curious townspeople who'd come to witness the spectacle of the shortest man in Millerville marrying the tallest woman. Charlotte wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that she'd brought from Boston. Silas wore his only suit, the same one he'd worn to meet her at the train station. They stood before Pastor Williams, Charlotte having to lean down significantly for the traditional kiss, while the congregation watched in rapt silence. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, Pastor Williams announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss that followed was awkward given their height difference, but genuine and tender. When they broke apart, Charlotte was smiling through tears, and Silas felt like he could take on the world. Edmund Fairmont arrived at the church just as the ceremony concluded, his face purple with rage when he realized what had happened. This is invalid, he shouted. She's not competent to make such a decision. Actually, Judge Morrison said mildly, she's legally married now. That changes things considerably regarding any commitment proceedings. The marriage can be annulled. On what grounds, the judge asked. Seems to me like two adults of sound mind who wanted to get married. Nothing illegal about being tall or short. Last I checked. Edmund sputtered and threatened and waved his commitment papers, but the legal ground had shifted beneath his feet. Charlotte was no longer an unmarried woman under family authority. She was a married woman with a husband who could speak for her welfare. That evening, as Silas and Charlotte sat on their porch as husband and wife, watching Edmund's carriage disappear toward the train station, Charlotte leaned against her new husband's shoulder. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For believing I was worth fighting for. For giving me the chance to choose my own life. Silas reached up to touch her face. Charlotte, you've given me something I never thought I'd have. A partner who sees the world from a different perspective, but somehow sees me exactly as I am. And what do you see when you look at me? I see my wife. I see the woman who makes me feel like the luckiest man in Montana, regardless of what anyone else thinks about our proportions. Charlotte smiled and bent down to kiss him properly. I love you, Silas Wellington. All 5 feet 4 inches of you. And I love you, Charlotte Wellington. All 6 feet 2 inches of you. As the stars came out over Montana, the newlyweds sat together, finally free to love each other without apology or explanation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they were simply two people who'd found their perfect fit. The first month of marriage brought an unexpected honeymoon period for Silas and Charlotte. With the threat of Uncle Edmund's interference removed, they were free to explore their partnership without the pressure of outside expectations. The ranch had never run more efficiently, their complementary skills creating a harmony that surprised even them. Charlotte's height made her invaluable for tasks Silas had always struggled with, cleaning the upper windows, hanging laundry on the tall lines, spotting problems across distant pastures. Meanwhile, Silas's compact build and lower center of gravity made him perfect for detailed work, repairs in tight spaces, and maintaining balance on uneven ground. They moved around each other with increasing ease, their different proportions becoming advantages rather than obstacles. You know, Charlotte said one morning as she easily adjusted the weather vane atop the barn, while Silas held the ladder steady below, I don't think I've ever felt this useful before. How so? Silas called up to her. Back in Boston, everything was designed around making me feel like a problem to be solved. Here, being tall is actually helpful. I'm contributing something real. Well, you're certainly contributing, Silas agreed, admiring the way she handled the delicate adjustments with confident precision. Though I'd venture it's more than just your height that makes you valuable. Charlotte smiled down at him. Careful, Mr. Wellington, or I might start believing you actually like having me around. Mrs. Wellington, Silas replied with a grin, I more than like having you around. I wonder how I managed without you. Their contentment was tested when news arrived that the territorial governor would be visiting Millerville as part of his autumn tour. The town was buzzing with preparation, and every prominent family was expected to attend the welcoming reception. For Silas and Charlotte, it represented their first major social test as a married couple. We could simply not attend, Charlotte suggested as they discussed the upcoming event. It's not as though we're required to go. We could, Silas agreed, but that would be letting them win. Besides, I'm curious to see how we handle it together. Charlotte studied his face. You're different than you were a month ago, more confident. Having a 6'2" wife who can handle anything life throws at her has a way of making a man feel more secure, Silas replied. I'm not the same person who thought he needed a small woman to make him feel big. The night of the reception, Charlotte wore her finest dress, a deep green silk she'd brought from Boston, but never had occasion to wear. The color brought out her eyes and complemented her honey-colored hair, which she'd arranged in an elegant style that added to her already impressive height. Silas wore his best suit and found himself standing taller as they walked into the crowded town hall together. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to stare at the tall woman and her compact husband. But this time, instead of hunching her shoulders or trying to make herself smaller, Charlotte walked with her spine straight and her head high. And instead of feeling diminished by the attention, Silas found himself proud to be the man beside her. Wellington. Governor Stevens approached them with genuine interest. I've been hearing stories about you two. Something about a rescue involving creative problem-solving? Word of their teamwork in saving Widow Crawford had apparently traveled beyond Millerville. As Silas and Charlotte recounted the story, other couples began to gather around, listening with growing interest rather than mockery. Fascinating, the governor mused. It sounds like you've discovered something that many couples never learn, how to make your differences work for you rather than against you. We're still learning, Charlotte said modestly. But yes, we've found that what makes us unusual as individuals can make us quite effective as a team. And how does the community feel about your unique partnership? Before either Silas or Charlotte could answer, an unexpected voice spoke up from behind them. They feel like they've been a pair of damn fools. They turned to see Judge Morrison approaching, his wife on his arm, and an expression of chagrin on his weathered face. Judge, Silas questioned. Been doing some thinking since your wedding, Morrison continued. My wife here had to knock some sense into me about the way we've been treating you both. Seems we've been so focused on how different you look together that we missed how well you work together. Mrs. Morrison nodded emphatically. What we've seen these past weeks is a marriage that actually functions. You support each other, you solve problems together, and you make each other better. That's more than can be said for half the couples in this town. Other voices began to join in, as neighbors and friends who had initially been skeptical started sharing observations about the Wellingtons' partnership. The conversation gradually shifted from their physical differences to their practical compatibility, their mutual respect, and their obvious affection for each other. You know what I think? Said Dr. Matthews, the town physician. I think we've been looking at this all wrong. Marriage isn't about finding someone who looks right standing next to you. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are. The evening was proceeding better than either Silas or Charlotte had dared hope when trouble arrived in the form of Richard Blackwood, Silas's estranged cousin from Denver. Richard was everything Silas wasn't. Tall, conventionally handsome, and possessed of the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove himself. Well, Richard drawled as he approached the group, his eyes taking in Charlotte's impressive stature with obvious amusement. If it isn't my little cousin and his substantial bride. The warmth that had been building around Silas and Charlotte evaporated instantly. Richard had a talent for finding the exact words that would cause maximum discomfort. Richard, Silas said carefully, I didn't know you were in town. Business in the area. Heard about your recent marriage and simply had to see for myself. Richard's gaze traveled up and down Charlotte's frame with deliberate rudeness. My goodness, Charlotte, isn't it? You certainly are. Impressive. Silas always did have unusual tastes. Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Mr. Blackwood, Silas has mentioned you. All good things, I hope. Richard smiled coldly. Though knowing Silas, probably not. We've never quite seen eye to eye. Of course, that's easier for some people than others. The cutting reference to their height difference hung in the air like poison. Silas felt his old insecurities rising, the familiar shame that had haunted him for years, threatening to overwhelm the confidence he'd built with Charlotte. Richard, Governor Stevens interjected, his voice carrying clear disapproval. Perhaps you'd like to explain what business brings you to our territory. Land speculation, mostly. Looking for properties that might be undervalued due to their current management. Richard's eyes locked with Silas's. Sometimes a change in ownership can work wonders for a struggling operation. The threat was clear. Richard wasn't just here to embarrass them. He was here to take advantage of any weakness he could create. If he could undermine Silas's standing in the community, if he could make the marriage seem like a joke, it would affect Silas's business relationships and potentially his ability to maintain the ranch. The Wellington Ranch seems to be thriving, Dr. Matthews observed. I've seen the improvements they've made working together. Oh, I'm sure Charlotte has been very helpful, Richard said with a smirk, though I have to wonder how sustainable such an arrangement really is. After all, what happens when the novelty wears off? Charlotte stepped forward then, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for who she was. Mr. Blackwood, I understand you're concerned about your cousin's welfare. That's admirable family loyalty. But I should point out that Silas and I don't base our marriage on novelty. We base it on partnership, respect, and the kind of love that makes each of us stronger than we are alone. How poetic, Richard sneered. But can poetry pay the bills when reality sets in? Mr. Blackwood, Charlotte continued, her height suddenly seeming less like an oddity and more like an advantage. I've noticed that men who need to diminish others to feel important usually do so because they're lacking something essential themselves. I wonder what that might be in your case. The crowd had gone completely silent, watching this confrontation with rapt attention. Richard's face flushed red as he realized that Charlotte had just turned his own weapon against him, using his need to tear them down as evidence of his own insecurity. Silas stepped up beside his wife, no longer feeling small next to her, but feeling part of something larger than himself. Richard, you're family, so I'll say this once. Charlotte and I are building something together that works for us. If you can't respect that, you're welcome to take your land speculation somewhere else. Is that so? Richard's voice was dangerous now. And what if I told you I could buy your mortgage from the bank? What if I told you that your little domestic experiment might be coming to an end, whether you like it or not? The crowd murmured in shock. But before Silas could respond, Judge Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Blackwood, are you threatening a member of our community? I'm simply pointing out economic realities, Richard replied smoothly. Well then, the governor said quietly, let me point out some realities of my own. I've been looking for successful examples of frontier partnerships to highlight in my territorial reports. The Wellingtons seem like exactly the kind of innovative, hardworking couples we want to encourage. I suspect there might be territorial incentives available for operations like theirs. The meaning was clear. Richard might have money, but he didn't have political influence. And the governor was making it known that the Wellingtons had earned official recognition for their success. Richard looked around the room, realizing that his attempt to isolate and embarrass his cousin had backfired completely. The community that had once mocked the mismatched couple was now rallying to defend them. Well, Richard said with forced lightness, I can see you've all been thoroughly charmed. I suppose I'll have to look elsewhere for investment opportunities. As Richard retreated, Silas felt Charlotte's hand slip into his. Around them, the conversation gradually resumed, but with a different quality than before. They were no longer curiosities to be stared at. They were neighbors to be protected. You know what I realized tonight? Charlotte said quietly as they walked home under the Montana stars. What's that? We stopped trying to fit other people's idea of what we should be and started being what we actually are. And what are we? Charlotte smiled. We're us. And apparently that's enough. Spring came early to Montana that year, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed to celebrate renewal and growth. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Richard Blackwood, and the threatened financial trouble had never materialized. Word of the governor's interest in their innovative partnership had reached the territorial bank, along with several inquiries from other officials interested in their methods of complementary ranching. Far from being a liability, their unusual marriage had become something of an asset. Charlotte stood in their newly expanded garden, her height allowing her to easily tend the trellises that would have required Silas to use a ladder. She was humming softly to herself as she worked, a sound that still made Silas smile whenever he heard it. The garden had been her idea, an efficient system where her reach handled the vertical growing spaces, while his attention to detail managed the ground-level crops. Charlotte, Silas called from the porch, where he was repairing a rocking chair. We've got visitors coming up the drive. Charlotte shaded her eyes and looked toward the approaching wagon. That's Dr. Matthews, she said, recognizing the physician's distinctive black buggy. I wonder what brings him out here. Dr. Matthews climbed down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man in his 60s, his medical bag in hand. Morning, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Doc, Silas replied, setting down his tools. What can we do for you? Actually, it's what you've already done that brings me here. Dr. Matthews accepted Charlotte's offer of a glass of lemonade and settled into the chair Silas had been working on. I've been corresponding with some colleagues back east about your situation, and I wanted to discuss something with you both. Charlotte and Silas exchanged glances. Our situation? Charlotte asked carefully. Your marriage, your partnership, the way you've made your differences work for you instead of against you. Dr. Matthews pulled out a thick folder from his bag. There's a professor at Harvard Medical School who's been studying what he calls complementary partnerships, couples who achieve greater success together than either could manage alone. He's particularly interested in cases where physical differences create advantages rather than obstacles. He wants to study us, Silas asked, not sure whether to be flattered or concerned. More than that, he wants to use your story as an example in his lectures about the importance of looking beyond conventional expectations in both medicine and society. There's even talk of including your case in a paper. He's writing about the benefits of diversity in human partnerships. Charlotte sat down heavily in the chair beside Silas. Dr. Matthews, we're just living our lives. We're not trying to be an example of anything. That's exactly what makes you such a powerful example, the doctor replied. You didn't set out to prove a point. You just figured out how to make things work. But in doing so, you've demonstrated something important about human potential. What kind of something? Silas asked. That strength comes in many forms. That partnership isn't about finding someone identical to yourself, but about finding someone whose differences complement your own. That what society sees as mismatched might actually be perfectly balanced. Dr. Matthews opened his folder and pulled out several letters. I've heard from other couples who read about your story in the territorial newspapers. Couples who felt like misfits because of their own differences. Height, age, background, abilities. Your success has given them hope that they don't have to fit conventional molds to find happiness. Charlotte picked up one of the letters, her eyes scanning the careful handwriting. This woman says her husband is in a wheelchair, and people told her she was foolish to marry him because he couldn't be a proper provider. But she says reading about us made her realize that different kinds of strength can work together. And this one, Silas read from another letter, is from a man who's been ashamed of his stutter his whole life. He says seeing how we turned our differences into advantages made him realize his wife's patience and his determination make them a good team, speech impediment and all. Dr. Matthews nodded. That's the power of what you've accomplished. You've shown people that love doesn't require conformity. As if summoned by their conversation about partnerships and differences, Charlotte suddenly pressed a hand to her stomach, her face going pale. Charlotte! Silas was on his feet immediately. What's wrong? I think I'm going to be sick, she managed before rushing toward the house. Dr. Matthews and Silas exchanged knowing looks. How long has she been having morning sickness? The doctor asked gently. Morning sick? Oh, Silas felt his knees go weak. Oh my God, do you think? I think, Dr. Matthews said with a smile, I might want to examine your wife when she's feeling up to it. An hour later, after a thorough examination and several pointed questions, Dr. Matthews confirmed what they'd both begun to suspect. Charlotte was pregnant, about 2 months along, and everything appeared to be progressing normally. But what about, Charlotte began, then stopped, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. What about what? Dr. Matthews asked kindly. The baby. With our differences, what if the child inherits problems from our unusual proportions? Dr. Matthews set down his stethoscope and looked at both of them seriously. Charlotte, Silas, I want you to listen carefully. Height is largely hereditary, yes, but it's not a disease or a defect. Your child might be tall, might be average, might be compact. Whatever they are, they'll be perfectly healthy and normal. But people will expect, Silas started. People will expect lots of things, the doctor interrupted. Just like they expected your marriage to fail. How did that work out for them? Charlotte and Silas looked at each other, the truth of his words sinking in. They'd spent so much time learning to ignore other people's expectations about their relationship that they'd momentarily forgotten to apply the same wisdom to their child. Besides, Dr. Matthews continued with a twinkle in his eye, have you considered the advantages your child will have? A mother who can reach anything and see everything. A father who can fix anything and notice details others miss. Parents who have already proven they can work together to solve any problem that comes up. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Charlotte rested her hand on her still flat stomach. Are you worried? She asked. About what? About raising a child when we're still figuring out how to be married to each other. Silas considered this. Charlotte, 6 months ago, I was a lonely man who thought he needed a small wife to make him feel important. Now I'm married to a woman who makes me feel like I can handle anything life throws at us. If we can figure that out, I reckon we can figure out how to raise a child. Even if the child is exceptionally tall or exceptionally short, especially then. Silas reached over and took her hand. Who better to raise a child who might be different than parents who've learned to love their own differences? Charlotte smiled, but Silas could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. What if I'm terrible at it? What if being a mother requires skills I don't have? Like what? I don't know. Nurturing? Gentleness? All the things that supposedly come naturally to small, delicate women? Silas turned in his chair to face her fully. Charlotte Wellington, you've spent the last 6 months nurturing me back to confidence, gentleness with my pride when it was battered, patience when I was struggling to learn new ways of thinking. If that's not maternal instinct, I don't know what is. You really think we can do this? I think, Silas said, standing and pulling her to her feet, that we're going to raise a child who grows up knowing that being different isn't something to apologize for. It's something to celebrate. They're going to learn that strength comes in all sizes, that love doesn't require matching proportions, and that the most important thing about any person is who they choose to be, not how they happen to be built. Charlotte leaned down to kiss him, and as she did, Silas marveled again at how natural the gesture had become. Where once he'd felt awkward about their height difference, now it simply felt like them. I love you, Silas Wellington, Charlotte murmured against his lips. I love you too, Charlotte Wellington. All of you, the woman you were when you stepped off that train, the woman you've become as my wife, and the mother you're going to be. 9 months later, Charlotte delivered a healthy baby girl who measured exactly 21 inches long, perfectly average for a newborn, neither exceptionally tall nor particularly compact. They named her Hope because she represented the future they'd built together, despite everyone's expectations. As Silas held his daughter for the first time, looking up at Charlotte, who was beaming despite her exhaustion, he realized something profound. They'd started their marriage worried about proportions, his height, her height, how they looked together, what people would think. But what they'd learned was that the only proportions that mattered were the ones that couldn't be measured. The proportion of love to fear, of acceptance to judgment, of courage to conformity. "She's perfect," Charlotte whispered, reaching down to touch their daughter's tiny hand. "She's ours," Silas replied, and somehow that seemed to encompass everything that mattered. Years later, when people would ask them about their unusual love story, Charlotte and Silas would always give the same answer. They'd ordered completely wrong and received exactly right. The tall woman and the compact man had found their perfect proportions, not in matching measurements, but in the immeasurable spaces where one heart reaches toward another. Their daughter Hope would grow up to be exactly average height, but with the extraordinary confidence that comes from parents who taught her that being different isn't a flaw to fix. It's a strength to celebrate. And sometimes, when she was old enough to understand, they would tell her about the day they learned that love doesn't measure itself in inches, but in the infinite distances two people are willing to travel to meet each other halfway. The Wellington Ranch prospered not despite their differences, but because of them. And in a world that too often demanded conformity, they stood as living proof that the most beautiful partnerships aren't created when two people are identical, but when two people are willing to be exactly who they are, together. And so concludes the extraordinary tale of Silas Wellington and Charlotte Mason, a story that proves the most perfect matches often come in the most unexpected packages. When Silas placed that advertisement seeking a small, quiet wife under 5 feet tall, he thought he knew exactly what he needed. When Charlotte answered mail-order bride advertisements without mentioning her impressive stature, she thought she knew exactly what men wanted. Both were wrong, and both discovered that being wrong can sometimes lead to being beautifully, perfectly right. Their story resonates because it addresses something universal, the fear that we're somehow wrong for who we are. Silas spent 32 years believing his compact frame made him less of a man. Charlotte spent 26 years thinking her height made her less of a woman. Society had convinced them both that love required conformity, that partnerships only worked when people fit predetermined molds. But what they discovered together changed everything. Love doesn't measure itself in inches or pounds or any other external standard. Real love looks past the surface to find the heart, the character, the soul that makes each person unique. More importantly, it celebrates those differences instead of trying to minimize them. Silas learned that masculinity isn't about towering over your partner. It's about standing beside them with strength, confidence, and unwavering support. His worth as a man wasn't diminished by having to look up to meet Charlotte's eyes. It was enhanced by his willingness to do so with love and admiration instead of shame or resentment. Charlotte discovered that femininity isn't about making yourself smaller to accommodate others' comfort. Her height, her presence, her ability to take up space in the world, these weren't flaws to hide, but gifts to celebrate. The right partner wouldn't ask her to shrink. He would help her stand even taller. Their partnership worked because they stopped trying to fit society's expectations and started building something uniquely their own. Charlotte's height wasn't a problem to solve. It was an advantage that made their ranch more efficient, their teamwork more effective, their partnership more dynamic. Silas's compact frame wasn't a limitation to overcome. It was a perfect complement to Charlotte's reach, creating a team that could handle any challenge. The obstacles they faced were real and significant: social ridicule, family interference, financial threats, and the constant pressure to conform to conventional standards. But each challenge only strengthened their resolve and deepened their connection. They learned that external validation is nice to have, but not necessary to have. The only approval that mattered was their own, and the only standard they needed to meet was the one they set together. Their story also highlights the power of community growth. Millerville's initial mockery gradually transformed into respect as people witnessed the strength of Silas and Charlotte's partnership. The townspeople learned that different doesn't mean wrong, that unusual doesn't mean inferior, that love comes in many forms and all of them are valid when they're real. The academic recognition they receive speaks to a larger truth, that diversity in partnerships often creates strength rather than weakness. Different perspectives, different abilities, different approaches to problems can combine to create solutions that neither person could achieve alone. What looks like a mismatch to outsiders might actually be a perfect complement to those involved. Their daughter Hope represents the future they created together, a child who will grow up understanding that differences are not defects, that love transcends physical characteristics, that strength comes in many forms. She'll learn these lessons not from lectures but from living example, watching parents who celebrate each other's uniqueness instead of trying to change it. The letters they receive from other couples facing their own challenges remind us that everyone feels mismatched sometimes, whether it's height, age, background, abilities, or any other difference that makes people feel like they don't fit society's narrow definitions of normal. Charlotte and Silas's story offers hope. It says that love finds a way, that partnerships can thrive on differences, that happiness doesn't require conformity. For modern readers, their tale offers valuable lessons about self-acceptance and authentic relationships. In a world obsessed with perfect matches and ideal proportions, they remind us that real compatibility comes from deeper places than physical characteristics. It comes from shared values, mutual respect, complementary strengths, and the willingness to build something beautiful together. Their story also speaks to anyone who's ever felt too much or too little of something, too tall, too short, too loud, too quiet, too anything that made them feel like they needed to apologize for existing. Charlotte and Silas learned to stop apologizing and start celebrating, and their joy became contagious. Perhaps most importantly, they proved that love doesn't require perfection, it requires acceptance. They didn't change each other, they revealed each other. They didn't fix what was wrong, they celebrated what was right. They didn't try to become someone else's ideal, they became ideal for each other. If this story of unexpected love, unconventional partnerships, and the courage to be authentically yourself touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about a time when being different became your strength, or when you discovered that what you thought you wanted wasn't what you actually needed. Remember that the most beautiful love stories aren't about finding someone who fits society's expectations. They're about finding someone who helps you exceed your own. Keep your hearts open to unexpected possibilities, your minds open to unconventional partnerships, and your spirits ready to celebrate differences instead of hiding them. Sometimes the best things in life come in packages we never thought to order, proving that love's greatest gift isn't giving us what we ask for. It's giving us what we never knew we needed.